Welcome back to Capital H. We're here live at Deloitte University, where we're hosting 40-ish senior HR leaders who are aspiring to become CHROs or Chief People Officers. And I'm thrilled that we have Inna Landman, who is the Chief People Officer of Procore Technologies, joining us. She spoke with the cohort earlier and now is sharing some of her story with you all, our Capital H listeners. So Inna, thank you so much for joining us here at Deloitte University, not only for the Academy at large, but to share your story with our Capital H listeners.
Thanks, Kyle, for having me back. I really enjoyed my participation back in 2018 and happy to give back.
Well, Inna, let's start with a little bit about your story so that the audience understands that trajectory and that journey that you took to becoming a Chief People Officer. You shared that you started in the business before. Like, your story was not one of, I started in HR and I grew within the function. So do you want to share with folks kind of where your journey started on that path to becoming a Chief People Officer?
Sure. So my first job out of college, which is the sort of monumental job and how it has framed my thinking about the business world, was at Mervyn's, which was a retailer owned by Target. And I was leading the distribution center, or a portion of the distribution center. I would go every Monday to our GM meetings, and I would come in for my portion of the meeting to talk about my part of the distribution center. I would leave. My peer would come in and talk about his. He would leave. And what I noticed from every Monday GM meeting was that the only person in the room that stayed for the entire meeting was the head of HR of the distribution center. And I thought to myself, I want to sit in her seat because I want to know how all the parts of the business work, not just my part of the business. And when I saw her participating, I thought to myself, that's the seat I want to sit in. And it looks like HR is what gets to see the whole thing. So there was an individual contributor, sort of HR administrator job that opened. And that was my entry into HR. I had the opportunity to work in lots of amazing companies, mostly in the business partner space.
Sure.
And then spent the last 11 years at Workday, which is where I expanded my reach of my functional HR expertise from HR business partners to analytics, M&A, HR operations, talent acquisition, and then leading our COVID response.
You've covered it all. And one of the things that I think is so incredible about where your story started is seeing an HR leader who was covering the breadth of the business, right? Because I think there is a easy narrative at times, sometimes, that is perhaps media driven of, oh, hey, HR needs to be more strategic. HR needs to know the business. Oftentimes, HR professionals are in the position that they do know the business and they know the business the closest because, to your example, they're sitting and hearing all aspects of it.
I think that's where the value add really comes in from a CHRO perspective. We say that you have to be a business person first and HR is table stakes. I'm not sure we do a great job as a community to actually describe what that means.
Sure.
And in my eyes, it's, do you understand the business drivers? Like, can you actually have a conversation with your CEO, with your CFO, with your CRO about growth and revenue and efficiency and margin? And then can you figure out where the talent implications come in driving those business outcomes? That's really what business-minded CHROs do.
Yeah. And I think some of the story that you've shared and the experiences that you've had would say it's not that much of a flip or a switch to make in terms of this stuff. It's just, how do you articulate it slightly differently to the different leaders that you're engaging with?
That's exactly right. I think the biggest compliment that you can get from an executive is one that says, thank you for not bringing me a bunch of HR stuff into our meetings. Thank you for talking broadly about the business and how people and talent can contribute and enable that versus coming in with, here's a bunch of HR stuff we have to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Inna, you shared a little bit about what your journey was from a career perspective into HR and kind of the breadth and depth of the function that you've covered. So share now a little bit, what was that moment that said, Chief People Officer, I'm ready to pursue that path?
As I said, I've done a lot of the functions, and there came a moment, and I can't actually remember when it was, but there came a moment when I looked at my boss and I said, I think I can do this job. I think I want to do this job, and I think I want to try it. And so through my own exploration, there came a moment in my career about 3 years ago where I had an opportunity to take a CPO job. And when I talked to my boss about it, she was highly encouraging for me to stay for all the right reasons and to instead send me on an international assignment and spend some time outside the US because that was sort of the last thing I needed to round out my experience. And I did, honestly, Kyle, I did a lot of soul searching.
Yeah.
CHRO offers don't always come around. And I did a lot of soul searching of what was important for me in that moment. And after some advice and some retreats and a lot of thinking, I took the plunge to stay in a number 2 role and get the experience outside the US because a very wise CHRO told me there'll be lots of CHRO opportunities that are coming your way. There probably will not be that many opportunities to live outside the US, so take that one.
And, one of the things that I like that you shared in the plenary session was where you think about things with your head versus relative your heart, your soul, some of those things from a life perspective. And that quite often people are in the pursuit of what is that next title, right? But once you have that C-suite title, you're there, right? And if you have so much of life and career ahead, at what point do you make some of those choices so that when you look back later in life, you're like, hey, I'm so glad I took that international moment because it's a life experience that's more than just a career experience.
I had to go through my own soul finding journey, I guess you could call, when I reached my burnout after leading COVID. And those were some of the questions that I was asking myself deeply. Who am I? What's important to me? How do I think about the rest of my life? We're so used to, or at least I was so used to climbing the ladder and checking the box. And I've done this thing and I've gotten this job and I've gotten this title. But there came a point where I literally fell down, mentally collapsed and said, this is not how I want to live life. So I did a lot of work, internal work with some outside help and did a lot of soul searching and started to learn how to listen to my soul versus how to listen to everybody else's expectations and the climbing of ladders that we're so used to. And that example of, should I go live in Europe or should I take a CPO job, was one of the first times when I exercised that. And I said to myself, okay, the climbing the ladder person's going to take the CHRO job, but Inna's soul needs to have a different life experience.
Yeah.
And I went and had that different life experience. And I don't regret it for a second. It has changed the way that I think about life and everything else. And then I ended up getting the CPO job anyways afterwards.
Yeah.
So I think for me, listening to myself and doing what I call soul work is really important in just keeping sane.
Yeah. Well, and I know that the audience earlier was incredibly grateful for you sharing that journey. I spoke with a couple of people afterwards who said that they are still grappling with it themselves. Do they want to pursue? And part of this whole Next Gen CHRO Academy is to help people decide, right? Because it's okay to say, I don't want that role. And then it's also very much okay to say, I do want it. But if I do want it, here's the things I need to do to go after it. Here's how I need to make sure it's right for me, not someone else saying that I should do it. So Inna, you went to Paris, you had this international experience, and then this chief people officer opportunity came back around. So talk a little bit through, as you then went to engage with the CEO, the C-suite, the board from an interview process, how did you decide this was right for you at that point in time?
I call this sort of the serendipitous moment of my life because when I was making that decision between, do I take the CPO job or do I go live internationally? It was for Procore Technologies. So that was when I had my interview process. I had a really strong connection with the CEO. I find that to be a really important aspect. That was important to me in terms of how deciding which job I take. And I remember living in Paris and I remember thinking about that job and thinking about, did I let one get away?
Yeah.
And again, the world just works in mysterious ways. You follow your heart. And then I was coming back from Paris and they called again and they said, the job's open again.
Yep.
So I met with him again. I met with the C-suite because they've changed some leaders out since the last time I talked to them. I met with the board. And for me, a couple of things stood out that was really important for me of how I decided to take the job. The first, as I said, is the CEO chemistry. You have to be able to gauge, even in that first interview, can you have a direct and honest conversation? Can you go banter back and forth? Will this person listen to you and listen to your feedback? And can he dish it out to you as well, right? That dynamic, that sort of battling back and forth is really important for the relationship. So that was important. I think the second for me is the mission of the company. I really resonated with the mission of the company. As I do my soul work, I realized that life on earth is short. And if we're going to do really hard work, which this job is really hard, I want to do it for a mission-based and value-based company.
Yeah.
So that was the second thing that was really important. And the third were just some of the elements. I've wanted it to be public. I wanted to stay in tech. It was a growth story. The size of the company was sort of my sweet spot. And again, I listened to my intuition. I got off those calls, and I had done some additional interviews before that. And my soul just said, this is it. Again, it's a moment of serendipity. And here I am 7 months later.
And a lot can happen in 7 months. And also, there's what I've heard from other CHROs, what I heard from you earlier today is there's what you know going into the role, and then there's the reality, right? Whether there are external factors that are changing at play, internal factors, the team, you name it. There's all sorts of things that become the reality of now you're in the seat to have to grapple with. So share a little bit about what are some of the things that you've learned in that 7-month period of time?
I thought I knew the job, Kyle. As I said on stage today, I had a fortune of working for a great CHRO at Workday who gave me lots of different experiences, and I learned a lot about how to run an HR function. And I was fairly confident going into the job. And then I got into the job, and I was like, oh, this is what the job is. The dynamic nature of moving between managing your function to being a peer and sometimes a leader of the C-suite with the C-suite, to managing the dynamics of the board, and how all of that fluctuates back and forth during major geopolitical and other sort of worldly issues that are affecting our day jobs every day. The dynamic nature of all of that was what I did not appreciate.
Sure.
I knew how to run an HR function. I was the functional leader of many of sort of your typical HR organizations, departments, but I underappreciated the art of the job versus the science of the job. I underappreciated the coaching, the almost COO nature that I have taken on in this job, the connection building, the influencing, the leadership, hard charging conversations. I underappreciated how much time that takes and how important that is to being really good at this job.
Yeah. Well, and a thing I'll pick on, Inna, that you just said, the almost COO nature of the role, right? And there's data out that's been looking at CHRO roles that would say it is potentially the second hardest job in the C-suite after the CEO, because the scope, the breadth and depth of what the CHRO has been asked to cover at many companies has expanded, especially over the last 5 years. And there's also data that says the number of CHROs that are a top 5 named officer for public companies has increased. So CHROs are also being compensated accordingly for the very challenging role that you step in. Now, part of dealing with maybe the realities of that becomes, are you with the right team, right? What's that relationship with the C-suite? What's the relationship with the board, the team that you have in place as well? So can you talk a little bit about, how did you build those relationships with the C-suite, build those relationships with the board over the last 7 months? You interviewed with them, that's one thing. But then when you get into the text messaging relationship or really the personal aspects of getting to know them, their working style, and how you navigate all the things that you need to.
I think that my approach has always been, and even more so in this job, to deeply understand the business drivers and the motivators for every single C-suite person and start there. Not start, let's talk about this HR program and let's talk about this. Now, of course, if that's a pain point for them and if they can't hire the right people and if they can't hire fast enough or if they don't have the right skills to execute that business strategy, sure. But most of the time, the conversations are not about HR topics. Most of the time, the conversations are, we have to drive more margin efficiency. What is that going to look like for the company when 80% of our spend is on people-related costs? Most of that is, we have to change our go-to-market motion. How do we think about that in terms of the culture we have to drive in go-to-market, the kind of people we need to bring in? How do we make sure that we drive high performance to achieve our outcomes? So for me, it was really important to build individual C-suite and individual board member relationships in deeply understanding and speaking their language. That has been a big driver for me and quite honestly, a differentiator. I think one of the biggest compliments that my CEO and CFO gave me is they said, you never bring us HR stuff to talk about.
Yeah.
And that feels really good because when I'm in C-suite meetings, I don't just pipe in when it's time to talk about people or talent or those types of risks.
Yep.
We talk about alignment and strategy and where the company needs to go. And I offer my opinion on those just as much as I would expect them to offer opinions on people topics.
Yeah. Yeah. And fundamentally, your comment about 80% of the balance sheet being tied to people, probably very true for a majority of companies, whether public or private. And what that really means is every organization's business is people. Who knows people, internal and external talent market, implications, how do you motivate, incentivize, et cetera, the best? Arguably, the chief people officer and the function. But what does a CEO or a C-suite CFO want to hear? They don't want to hear, hey, the merit program will do ABC. They want to hear, in this talent market, to acquire this type of talent to enable our new market entry or new product launch, we're going to need to spend X to get the people who help us to achieve the business strategy, right? It's a slight shift of the language you're using that can still tie back to the programs the function delivers, but you're not talking about the programs in and of themselves.
Absolutely. We just had a leadership meeting last week where we brought in all of our VPs across the company that we do twice a year. And when it was my turn to talk about the state of the people, I didn't start with HR programs, right? I started with how much money do we spend as a company in our balance sheet? What's our budget? The percentage of that's spent on people programs, and what's the ROI that we're getting, right? And I chose to look at the revenue per employee metric.
Yeah.
Any company can do whatever they want. But for me, that's how I started the presentation, to talk about here's where we stand financially. Here's what we need to do in order to increase or decrease, depending where you are on that journey, your efficiency and the productivity and the effectiveness that you have on the people spend. And my CFO didn't tell me to start that presentation that way. My CEO didn't. But in my mind, I said, I have 100 vice presidents in this room
Right.
who care deeply about the business. Where is our business strategy going, both from a growth perspective and a margin efficiency perspective? And how do I talk about talent in language that they understand and that speaks the business? And you could just see, I mean, it was fascinating. The entire room, right? The HR person gets on stage. Usually everyone zones out and starts multitasking. And that's how they start out, right? Some people were on the couch over there and some people were on their phones. And then over the first 5 minutes, you could just see these people just merging into the center of the room. I've actually never seen anything like it. It was amazing. But those are the kinds of moments that give you hope and inspiration of this is how you get the business's attention.
Yeah.
And this is how you can drive people outcomes.
Yeah.
Because it's being spoken in their language that they understand, that they care about, that they're incentivized, that our shareholders care about, and all of our stakeholders.
Yeah. Well, and to your point right there, right? Public company, that's the language that the market is asking. So that's the language that the business leaders themselves have to tell to the market. So when someone's speaking their language, they're like, oh, you got it. You know me, right? You know what I'm focused on. So part of, I think, your journey into the role was articulating what's my leadership philosophy and how do I bring that type of discourse to the role, right? How am I going to bring that type of mentality and perspective to the C-suite, to the business leaders, and to the HR function themselves? So can you share a little bit about like what you did to ultimately encapsulate your philosophy and style so that you could then communicate it during the interview process, and then once you were in the role, communicate it to the board and to your function, like, this is who I am, this is what I stand for, and this is how we're going to drive business results?
Yeah, and we talked about this, Kyle, a little bit over with the cohort. I think defining your story and what kind of CHRO you are or want to be is really important.
Yeah.
I've had a chance to talk to lots of CHROs throughout my career, especially working at Workday. And there is a gamut, right? There is compliance and regulatory CHROs. There are very employee experience focused CHROs. There are CHROs that are really focused on building certain mindsets and empathy and vulnerability. There are CHROs that are solely focused on leadership or the business or whatever you want to call it. Like, I've seen such a variety, and different styles or philosophies work for different business needs, right? And so My advice has always been, and this is what I've done, is take some level of interviews over your course of exploration to number one, hone in your story. Number two, understand how that story resonates with the people that you're talking to. And then number three, come back from that and decide, is this my story? And am I convicted that this is the kind of CHRO that I think is going to add value?
Yep.
And if so, where do I go find that? Because that's not going to be the case for every industry, public, private, every size, every location. Honing in your story and having conviction to own it and be authentic, I think is super important. Of course, you have to be flexible and agile and shift, but you can't waffle.
Yeah.
Right? That's not what builds credibility.
Yeah.
And then to find your place where that story resonates and can make an impact is one of the best things that you can do for especially for your first CPO job.
Yeah. Well, and Nina, I think maybe another thing for folks to hear from you is part of your story was also acknowledging, yes, you've done an incredible breadth of things, led M&A, people analytics, talent acquisition, business partner role, et cetera. But there were also some areas that you weren't as deep, like total rewards. So can you share a little bit about how you articulated to the CEO, C-suite, and board, hey, here's an area that I'm maybe not as fluent, but here's what I'm doing to learn. And plus, here's what I'll do, whether it's someone on my team or my relationship with the CFO. And that's how we'll ultimately get the right set of expertise holistically.
I had always heard from other CPOs, the one thing you're missing is total rewards and exec comp. And that's so important. And again, I didn't fully grapple. I didn't fully understand how important that was. But I took, as I prepared for this role, I took some HRPA courses on executive comp. I did a ton of reading and a ton of research. And again, my leadership philosophy is be fully transparent and authentic to who you are. And during the interview process, yes, you have to tell a story and sell yourself, but also be authentic to who you are. So I was very clear with my board interviews and with my CEO after reading all the proxies and understanding their compensation structure for executives.
Yep.
Here's what I do know, right? Here's what I do know the drivers are of compensation, especially in a public company, right? And I talk about SBC and dilution and equity participation and all of those things. And so they understood that I had the concepts high level, but I was also very clear to say, this is my one gap from an experience perspective. I have not led total rewards. I have not done exec comp. And here's what I'm going to do to close that gap. Here's what I've already done, and here's what I'm going to do. I was really fortunate, am really fortunate to have a really great total rewards leader, and the board respects him as well. And I knew that going into the interview process. So I made sure to talk about the relationship I was going to build with him, the relationship I was going to build, obviously, with the CFO, and also with our comp consultants. I spent a lot of time with our comp consultant as soon as I joined to understand. And I'm now 7 months in. I've done, I think, 2 or 3 comp committee meetings, and I'm so much farther along than I was 7 months ago. So it is, I will say, it's a little bit of a scary topic. I thought it was scary because I'm like, well, I don't know what I'm doing. But 3 comp committee leaders or 2 comp committee meetings later, I have so much more confidence. And the comp committee has more confidence because I can have one-on-one conversations with them about philosophy and structure, and I have a deeper understanding. And so I think my takeaway is be authentic to what you know. Don't oversell. And if you know that's a gap, and if you're going into a public company job, figure out how you're going to close that gap. And find a company and a board and a CEO who's going to be willing for you to admit that and go close that gap. That was really important to me from a culture perspective.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think it emphasizes the point you shared earlier, which is you need to really think about what type of CHRO do you want to be and what type of role is right for you, right? And the experiences you bring, the team, the leadership, et cetera. So, Inna, the function, the role has continued to change, right? And you offered a little bit of perspective today to folks around where do you think there are certain trends or focus areas that people need to pay attention to as they prepare for an eventual CHRO, Chief People Officer role. So do you want to maybe give a couple thoughts on the 2 or 3 things you think other aspiring CHROs or listeners out there need to really pay attention to as far as what might be whole or what might be ahead for the future of the function?
Sure. I think AI, we can't have any conversation without talking about AI. And as I talked on stage earlier today, for me, it's not about AI in like 10 years of let's redesign all of our jobs. And It's going to take all of our jobs. Like we're jumping really ahead,
Yep,
right?
yep.
The way that I think about AI is how does an individual use it to help them learn,
Yeah,
be more productive, take away some of the mundane work so they can do more of the human work,
yep,
right? And so how do you think about building that skill, building that mindset in the organization, while at the same time figuring out how do you use AI to transform the HR function from your HR service delivery or maybe recruiting? Again, you got to just start somewhere instead
sure.
of boiling the ocean and saying, I got to rethink my whole job architecture because AI is going to change all these jobs.
Yep,
Sure, maybe later, right?
yep.
But so AI for me is the first thing that I think about. The second thing is the speed of business transformation right now is unlike anything I've seen before.
Yep.
I think COVID accelerated that, and every year it just gets faster and faster. And so, how do you think about planning, changing those plans, reacting to the world, reacting to the business shifting its strategies, and how do you bring the organization along?
Yeah,
Because that can feel really chaotic. Change is hard. And so, how do you think about the mindset and the culture, right? Changing the culture of the company to be more agile. So, that's the second. And then the third is, and this may sound fundamental, but manager and leader ecosystem skills is just so important. And perhaps for tech industries, because I think in the tech industry, we probably haven't gone as far with leadership as maybe some other industries in terms
sure,
of development and such. And I
sure.
think our managers are completely overloaded. They're lost many times. I think our leaders need different skills to take advantage of the new world order
Yep,
of business transformation and change and new technology. And what got us here won't get us there,
yeah,
right? And
yeah.
so this is a really pivotal moment in the world where we have to think differently about what we need in the workplace, specifically for managers and leaders.
Yeah. Well, and I think in the 2025 Human Capital Trends report that we just released a few weeks ago, there was a chapter around reimagining the role of managers. And the managers that were surveyed said about 40% of their time is spent either on administrative work or problem solving. So you think already folks are overloaded with a big chunk of their day, big chunk of their week on things that aren't necessarily adding business value. And then you think across different industries and sectors, right? Let's say tech industry, companies that went through significant growth, right? Many people became managers because they were there first. And as the company scaled, they were there, and so they became people manager. And of course, there are some tremendous people managers who are in the right place, but there are folks who probably shouldn't have been a people manager. And of that group, some who probably never wanted to be a people manager, but they were asked to do it. And they were like, oh, I guess I got to do it because someone told me to, right? And so I think one of the things that we're hypothesizing going forward is, to your point, can you use certain AI and automation capabilities to, one, lessen some of those firefighting moments or those blocking and tackling administrative things that are on the manager workload? Can you maybe reallocate the people who shouldn't be in people manager roles but are phenomenal individual contributors back into a place that allows them to leverage their best skills and strengths? And for those people managers who do remain, how do you really focus on the things that everyone knows the great managers do? Growing their people, giving proactive feedback, helping make hard decisions, right? So that's a really potential powerful moment for what's ahead.
I always talk about the idea that every single employee, whether you work for a senior executive or you work for a frontline manager, goes home at night and has dinner with their spouse or their significant other or their friends or their family, and they talk about their manager at their dinner table.
Yeah.
They always talk about their manager or their executive team at their dinner table. So what do you want them to say?
Yeah.
And how do you want them to feel
Yeah.
when they talk about you? Because you as a manager, as a leader, have a disproportionate impact on the experience people have at work.
Yeah.
And how many hours do we spend at work? I can't remember. There's a number out there somewhere.
Some might say too many.
Too many. I would vouch for that as well. Your manager, your leader, the trust that you have in your leadership can make or break that experience. And so we just have to remember that, and we have to build that. And I always ask people, think about how you want them to feel when they talk about you at the dinner table.
Yeah. I love that. So, Inna, maybe final question for you. You shared some advice and perspective for the folks who are here who are aspiring chief people officers on something they should consider in their journeys. For folks who are, audience listeners of the Capital H podcast, business leaders, HR professionals, folks in the ecosystem, what's one thing that you would offer for folks as they think about whether either their own path to chief people officer or as they work with chief people officers? Like, what does kind of the future of the role hold?
I think if you're an aspiring CPO, honing in your story of why and what kind of CPO you want to be is really important as you embark on this journey.
Yeah.
It really helps to provide clarity and conviction for how you show up as a CHRO at a new company. I think for business leaders, if you're not getting what you need from your CPOs from a business perspective, if you really view them only as they're here to manage my recruiting function or they're here to manage my employee relations function, you're not getting the most out of that job. You're just not. I mean, the opportunities are lost. They see the business holistically, right? They're not functionally aligned. They see the whole thing. And you should put the pressure on if you're not feeling it and set the expectation that you expect your CHRO to carry the same level of influence and business conversation around your executive table as you would expect from your CFO and your CRO.
Yeah. I think that's a powerful call to action for the business leaders out there. I've met many strategic chief people officers, strategic HR functions, and those ones are where the business broadly invests in the function, invests in the leader at the head of that function and says, I know that you can add value. You're not just a cost center. So I think that's a tremendous call to action for folks. And so, Inna, I want to just say thank you so much for not only joining us here at Deloitte University for the Next Gen CHRO Academy, but thank you for joining us on the Capital H podcast. And folks, stay tuned for more from the Academy. We'll have a couple of other chief people officers who will share their stories as well. So you'll have a mix of perspectives on the role, the future of the function, and things to think about as you're driving business and human outcomes for your organizations. Inna, thanks again.
Thanks, Kyle. That was a lot of fun.
This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to deloitte.com/about.